Hi everyone, I'm Cody Rue, and this is the Church of Logic. Today I'm going to talk. Shit. Hi everyone, I'm Cody Rue, and this is the Church of Logic. Today I'm going to talk about something I've been wanting to talk about for a long time, namely the Kruskal tree theorem and the number tree 3. So I briefly questioned whether I should even do this video because I've just seen on Numberphile they did a video on tree 3, which is something I wanted to talk about, and I mean, it's Numberphile. They're pros and they do a good job, and so I'm not sure that I can do a better job than they do, but I still, after viewing it again, I still feel like there's some value in doing this because they, they try to popularize and explain things in understandable terms, which is great, but I feel like sometimes you want to, if you have a certain level of math sophistication, you want to get into the details a little bit, and so I'm going to try and get into the details a little bit, or at least give you tools to get into the details, which is sort of like a second order getting into the details. Alright, so what's tree 3? I would recommend you watch the Numberphile video, which I'm not being sponsored by them, I guess, but it's really good. They explain that there's a number you can define that involves somehow looking at the longest sequence of trees that has this property, and it's a little awkward to explain, but I'm going to try anyway. And then they say, okay, well, that number is huge somehow, and they try to explain how huge it is by giving increasingly vague metaphors, but let's try and go over those definitions again and see if we can make more sense of them, at least given a broader context of logic. So, alright, basically the setup is you take trees, finite trees that are labeled. Each node has a label. That label is some letter of the alphabet or something. It's only important that it's a finite set, alright, for reasons I'll explain later. And you look at something called the embedding relation. The embedding relation is this. You're allowed to take a tree and collapse edges, basically. You're allowed to take a node and sort of remove the node, and then one of its children just goes to the parent, right? And then you're allowed to repeat this process. You remove a node and then glue one of its children to the parent. And you repeat that. You take the transitive closure of that, and that is called the embedding order, because we've defined it to be the transitive closure of that, and actually the reflexive transitive closure. We have an order by definition. And great. All right, take this order. Embedding relation. This order makes sense on strings as well. Strings can be seen as trees where each node just has one child, right? Each node is labeled by the character in the string, and then the next one is the child. Okay, so strings have this embedding relation as well, and it's not trivial, right? It allows you to remove letters anywhere in the string, beginning and end. So it's not like the substring relation where it really has to appear somewhere exactly. All right. So this is a thing people have been thinking about for about 100 years, and there is a fact, which is that this order on trees for a finite number of labels is a Will-Quasi order. Now, I tried to look to see if I had talked about Will-Quasi orders before, and I feel like I have, but I couldn't find the episode. So I'm going to explain what it is again real quick. A Will-Quasi order is an ordering which has a certain property, and that property is somehow stronger than being well-founded. A Will-Quasi order says if you take any infinite sequence, right? And if you have a partial order, remember that any two things can either be ordered by the relation in one direction and the other, or not at all, right? That's the magic of a quasi-order, is that it's not total, right? Or sorry, a partial order, yes. Partial order is not total. And this tree embedding is definitely a partial order. There are things that are just not even related. Like, if you have the label F with a child, A on one side and B on the other, and the label G and then D on one side and E on the other, those aren't even related by this order, in neither direction. So, all right. So a well-founded order would say if you have, the first term greater than the second term, strictly greater than the third term, strictly greater than the fourth term, etc. You can't have an infinite sequence of these like descending things. A wall quasi-order is much stronger in some sense. It says you can take any infinite sequence at all, then eventually, a priori, these things are not at all related to each other. But if you're in a wall quasi-order, eventually in any infinite sequence, you're going to find one term which is less than a later term in the sequence. All right? So a wall quasi-order basically says you can't avoid this order forever. You can avoid it for a while, but you can't do it forever. And somehow, it doesn't seem too crazy that trees with embedding are ordered by this wall quasi-order relation, because in some sense that the tree embedding means it's smaller in some ways, right? And so if you have an infinite sequence of trees, eventually you feel like you'll get a bigger tree where all those same nodes appear in kind of the same order, and you could collapse and remove nodes in a way that would get you the previous one, right? And you can't go forever without eventually having this kind of repeat. That intuition is incomplete. You really, if you think about it harder, it's actually very hard to prove that this order on trees is a wall quasi-order. And this difficulty is intrinsic in some sense, because you can show that in reasonably strong logical systems, you can't even prove this theorem. All right? And that's why it gives rise to such big numbers. It's because you can't prove that these numbers exist in weak systems. All right, I haven't really explained what tree of n is. Basically, it is the largest sequence of trees, on n labels, where each tree can have size I, where I is its position in the sequence. Now, if you think about it, the fact that trees are well quasi-ordered proves that tree of n is finite. And I would recommend you to figure that out for yourself. Like, understand what that tree embedding order is, then understand what tree of n is, and then show that, the fact that it's a well quasi-order means that tree of n is finite. It means there is such a longest sequence. It's not completely trivial. I think it's worth thinking about. Okay, but what I want to do now is basically, just walk you through the basics of this proof. But I think I'm going to go back to basics. I'm going to actually make these videos short, and so I'll explain the proof next time. And for now, I'll just explain why it might be the case that this theorem is hard to prove in piano arithmetic. Something I've mentioned maybe multiple times, but I'll mention it again. There's some ordinal. I've explained the ordinal epsilon 0 maybe, and I've kind of explained it in this tree form, where you have kind of at the roots you have the size n, and then each time you go up in the tree, you basically add a power of omega, right? So if you have a tree whose children is some tree that represents an ordinal, then that's omega to the power of that ordinal. And then epsilon 0 basically says that those trees are well founded by some order on trees. But it turns out that that order on trees is the embedding order. At least it's implied by that embedding order. So, okay, I did say that well quasi-order and well-foundedness were distinct, but I implied that they're related. And they're related by this kind of amazing fact, which is if you have any order, where, so let's say it's a strict order, so we want to show that it's well-founded, but let's for now assume that it's not necessarily well-founded. And let's take the non-strict part. Let's see, is that true? Yes. Yes, let's take the non-strict part. And if you can show that non-strict part contains a well-quasi-order, then the strict part is well-founded. All right, and why is that? It's because imagine you have a decreasing sequence of terms in that strict order, and imagine that it's infinite. Now, because it contains a well-quasi-order, you know that there is an element in that sequence which is going to be smaller than a later element of that sequence, right? Perhaps weakly smaller. And that, because it's contained in the strict order, you know that that later element is going to be strictly larger than the previous element, strictly or weakly larger than the previous element. And that, combined with anti-symmetry, gives you like a forbidden cycle, right? You're going down, and then all of a sudden you go back up. And so, great, that means that this situation is impossible. And so if you contain a well-quasi-order, you must be well-founded. All right. And in fact, this containment relation is kind of surprising, right? Containing a well-quasi-order is a really powerful thing, and it's used often in rewriting to show that rewriting orders are well-founded. Great. Okay. So all this to say that the order that we define to be epsilon 0 turns out to be an order on trees, and that order on trees you can show that must contain this embedding order, and therefore it is well-founded, and it's kind of trivially well-founded. I mean, the labels are these trivial labels, right? There's only one kind of label, and so great. I mean, that that does it, right? Epsilon 0 is a thing that you cannot show as well-founded in Peano arithmetic. And therefore, because I can use the tree theorem to show that epsilon 0 is well-founded, I shouldn't be able to prove the tree theorem in Peano arithmetic. So that's a simple obstruction. But then there are much more powerful theories that still can't prove that tree theorem. And increasingly powerful theories it will be increasingly hard to show that they can't prove that theorem. And I'm hoping to get to that eventually. But next time I'll just talk about the proof of the tree theorem, and you can kind of see how it has this very infinitary flavor. But until then, I hope you're well, and take care.